Hello, welcome to the MuseScore Café for Wednesday, September 4th, 2019. My name is Marc Sabatella. I'm the Director of Education for MuseScore, and this is my weekly series of informal chats where I talk about some aspect of MuseScore and/or making music, and just show you a few things, answer questions if you're participating live and want to ask on the chat. So I had mentioned last week that I might talk about MuseScore 3.3. We did have a beta release, but there was a glitch in that. We're going to have a second beta this week, and then I'll talk about 3.3 next time. But the big change is going to have to do with palettes, and so that's what we'll talk about. But in honor of Hurricane Dorian, which is getting lots of press right now, I figured I would use this as an excuse to talk about the Dorian Mode, which is a scale, for those of you not familiar with what it is, and talk about not just the Dorian Mode, but modes in general, a little bit about the historical background, a little bit about practical applications, and so forth. Because as someone who both teaches Renaissance-era counterpoint, but also is a working jazz musician, the modes have like sort of two entirely different contexts in which I use this information. And so what I want to really talk about is the commonality here, rather than getting to really specific about Renaissance theory or really specific into jazz theory. I want to talk about modes in a broader sense. And again, as always, questions, comments, just ask. The modes. What are the modes? So let me get to a fresh new score here. I'll give it a name, and I will just use the treble staff. And that's fine. So the deal is, historically speaking, and I mean like going back hundreds of years, all we had were the 7 pitches A through G, right? And so I'll enter these here, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and A, and I guess I'll do so with sound this time. There we go. So these pitches here, the pitches A through G, and then I repeated A at the end to make it seem like a modern scale. Those were the only pitches that really existed. The reasons those exist has to do with the overtone series. I mean, there's actually mathematical, physiological, is that the right word? Physical, acoustic, whatever. There's scientific reasons why that set of 7 pitches, or at least a set of 7 pitches with a particular relationship, is an important set of pitches to have. The easiest way to talk about it is if I use the circle of fifths starting on low F. In fact, for this, I'm going to go over to the piano, and I'm going to go up fifths. There you go. That's 7 pitches that you get going up in fifths, and at that point, the next one would be this note here, which is between 2 notes we've already had. We've already had an F and a G. That F sharp is like one more note than we need. I'm not saying we're never going to use it, but there was a point, there was a value in stopping where we did, because it allowed us to have a set of pitches that you can arrange to form a scale of with no gaps in it. All the distances between the notes in the scale are either what we would now call a whole step, like there, or a half step, like here. So basically, if we want to define the scales as being a set of 7 pitches in which all adjacent notes are either whole steps or half steps, this arrangement of 7 pitches is one of the possible arrangements of 7 pitches. There's one other, and we'll, when I teach theory, I talk about it, but it's the melodic minor scale. Could you hear that? Melodic minor scale. So this set of pitches is kind of a really important set of pitches and has been used historically for many, many years. The idea of arranging them to form a scale now is when we get a little dicier with what different theorists would do or different musicians would do composing. And the distinction that I want to make is a scale is really not an interesting thing. Hey, good to see people here. Hello. putting the notes in order like this, I mean, that's about as interesting as the alphabet, really. I mean, that's what it is, right? A, B, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. My wife made that up. Uh, um, it's the alphabet song with only A through G. So the alphabet is already not very interesting. An alphabet with only 7 notes, only arranged in that order, would be not very interesting. What makes the alphabet interesting is you can make words out of it and then sentences and tell stories. What makes a scale interesting is that you can then take those notes to make melodies and so forth. So it's really not about the arrangement of notes to form a scale that was historically important. It was more to do with, well, here's our set of notes, but what's the central note, or the note that the term that would get used, or at least the English translation of the term, is the final. In other words, if you have a melody that goes something like this, oops, I didn't mean that one. Here. So that's an actual Renaissance melody, except I think these are actually half notes. Ooh, how about if I use my cool cut, and then under the edit menu, you'll see paste half duration. Ha, there you go. That's the half duration command. This melody is really just walking up and down that scale, but not in that particular order. It's starting with this E in the middle, and then it's walking down, it's skipping the B, both on the way down and on the way up, and then it has this big leap down to the A. This A could be considered the final. It's the note at which this melody felt like it was done. So what's really interesting about a mode isn't so much thinking about it in terms of arranging the notes in order. It's really, because it's also, we know now there's more than one octave in the world, right? We could, that same set of notes, we could keep going up octaves, keep going down octaves. There's not really a start and an end to it as a scale. What there is an end to the melodies built on that scale. So if you take that set of notes and then make the final be A, this is what we call the Aeolian mode. You thought I was going to say Dorian, or maybe you didn't. So this set of notes with A as the final is called the Aeolian mode. And then if you really want to get Renaissance specific, whether we, like this mode, this note here has notes, this melody has notes above that A and only up to the E and nothing below it. And whether you go all the way up to this A up here or start including notes below this final, there's like the hypo Aeolian mode and hypo Dorian, and all. The word hypo has to do with whether it uses notes below there. But that's not going to be interesting to me either, because really I want to see this as just a set of notes with A as the final. Now we have something that both jazz musicians and Renaissance specialists can agree on. Okay, Aeolian is that set of 7 notes with A as the final. The Dorian mode is that set of notes with D as the final. I really know this stuff, trust me. I just don't know my alphabet. So if I wrote that same melody here, in fact, well, I'll just write it out faster. This melody could be said to be in Dorian because it has D as its final. And it's really the same melody. If I took this melody here, and excuse me, it's that beginning of school year cold thing going on. If I take that melody and just paste it, I'll just paste it right here. And then I'm just going to transpose it down, and I'm lazy, I'm just going to do it with the arrow keys. There we go. You can see that this melody and this melody are really identical. All the intervals in them are the same. Aeolian and Dorian are, as far as the intervals in the melodies go, very similar. And if only you look at those first 5 notes, they're identical. So Dorian and Aeolian are quite related. Where they're going to be different is what happens if we add a next note. In fact, the actual melody, this melody continues, oops, it goes up to an F here. So it is still using just those 7 notes. If, on the other hand, we tried to write that same little snippet of melody here in Dorian starting on D, do, 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 do. Whoops. Do, 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 do. D, do, B. Right? This is a different melody than this. Here, that interval is called a perfect fourth. This interval here is called a tritone. Right? This interval here comes the bride, right? Perfect fourth if you learned your intervals that way. Maria, the Simpsons, whatever. It's a tritone interval. This interval, well, aside from being dissonant and frowned upon, stories of people being executed for using it, whatever. That's bull. As far as I know, anyhow. But whatever, this is a very different melody now. So if we wanted to write something and feel like Aeolian, even though we were starting on D, they would say, well, I want to do that, right? Maybe I want to have a melody. I want to have this melody, but I want to have it starting on D. Why would I want that? Well, for one thing, imitative counterpoint is really huge. In fact, at this point, I really just want to get that melody up. I want to show you the real thing. So I'm going to bring it up. I'm showing you mostly Renaissance-related things here rather than jazz things, but I promise it's all the same, and I'll talk about that as it goes. Because I'm using my development version, the file dialog, this is like not the real 3.3, it's a version that I'm working on myself. So what am I looking for? Basic music theory? No, I want this one. This work. So the actual piece starts this way. And then I lied about some of the rhythms, right? Whatever. And then, but the answering phrase comes in here. But then it actually cheats, and because this original melody started on E, this one starts on A, so the melodies are offset. But then the next phrase, the original melody was on A, but the answering phrase was also on A, because that's how they chose to avoid that problem of, oh no, it's going to have that weird note, that B, and it's going to sound weird, that tritone. So that type of thinking, we're going to adjust things to just use these 7 notes. That's really what Renaissance thinking really started from. But it's not just about that, because really sometimes we do want to have this same exact melody. And so we could just take that B and take it down to B flat. It's not one of the official 7 notes. It's a fictitious note, a ficta, to use the Latin term. And so this idea that we could take this set of notes, so if I write it out as a scale, write it out as a scale and get it all on one line. This is the Dorian mode. And the only difference really between the Dorian mode and the Aeolian mode, I mean, they start on different notes if we only want to use those 7 notes. But if we want to create something that sounds like the Dorian mode starting on D, all we have to do is take that B and lower it to B flat. So now we have the same arrangement. It's whole step, half step, whole, half, whole. So whole step, half, whole, half, whole. So we're going to have the same arrangement of intervals, whether we start on A or whether we start on D, if we make this B flat happen, this bit of ficta. Now in Germany, they like this note so much, they're like, we like that better than the B anyhow, we're just going to call this note B. And then the other guy is called H in Germany and in other parts of Eastern Europe. And this difference here, whether, the fact that you might have a piece with a final of D that sometimes uses B flat, but sometimes uses B, because B is a fine note. It's just not fine coming right after the F, really, is what it comes down to. And in fact, I often use the example, and maybe I'll go back to the piano of this, depending on how you learned Greensleeves, you either learned or you learned either learn bum, ba, da, 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 dum, or you learn bum, ba, da, 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 dum. You either learned it with the B flat or the B, or you learned or B or H if you're German. And at this point, it's not even a question of which is the right or the wrong way, because this distinction wasn't necessarily so solid then. It was more like you write the piece and then these sort of how you treat these ficta, or when you choose to make these chromatic alterations, the way we might call them now, that was often up to the discretion of the performer. So there was that little bit of improvisation that's allowable in this world. But this was one of the first accidentals that ever came into music, was this B flat, specifically so that we could have melodies that sounded like Aeolian but started on D. Conversely, maybe we want melodies that start on A but sound more like Dorian. So to get those, we'll need an F sharp. And now you can have an A Dorian. This scale is now the same intervals as Dorian. What this would have been with a B. That guy's Dorian, that guy's Aeolian. This guy's Dorian, this guy's Aeolian. So by introducing B flat and F sharp into the world of those 7 notes, you could have Aeolian starting 2 different places. You could have Dorian starting 2 different places. Well, that was cool. People liked that. Notice I haven't even talked about the major scale. That was a thing also. But man, Dorian and Aeolian were really so much of the music of the era, and I'm talking, 1500s, was really, so much of it was based more on Dorian and Aeolian. And so it sounds, minor to our ears, because minor, any scale that's got basically this minor third is considered a minor scale. So the scale that we call the minor scale is Aeolian. So this guy here is what's called the natural minor scale, because it doesn't have any accidentals. This guy with the F sharp is called the Dorian scale, because it really is, or mode, because it's the same that we would have gotten just starting on D with only the official 7 notes. So this was the original Dorian. This was sort of the second Dorian to ever enter the world. Say, well, if you start on A but add that F sharp, you can have another Dorian. Well, we can get another Dorian by using the B flat. We already invented a B flat, so we could have an Aeolian starting on D. But then at some point, someone realized, oh, well, if I take a G scale, this scale, not a G major scale, but again, just a G scale using only the official 7 notes, this is called Mixolydian. But if we take this B here and add the B flat that we've already learned exists, well, now we have a Dorian starting on G. So by using that same B flat, we could get another Dorian. Well, historically speaking, I can't say at what time people suddenly realized, or not so suddenly realized, you know what, I bet I could probably add more of these ficta, more of these accidentals as we call them now, and manage to get a Dorian scale starting on C, or a Dorian scale starting on E, or a Dorian scale starting on B, or whatever. And eventually you end up with all the accidentals that we have now, and you end up with this 12-tone scale that we have now with all the black keys in there. Although really you need more than 12 notes to do that. You need both an A sharp and a B flat. You need both a C sharp and a D flat in order to really make all these scales possible. It's just that they sound, and again, if you calculate the frequencies, they're slightly different frequencies, but people realize, man, those are so close to the same frequency. I bet if we make a keyboard instrument, just put this black key between the C and the D, and then tell people, oh, if the music calls for a C sharp or a D flat, you can just play that same black key. That's what Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier is about, is realizing that, they have now designed keyboard instruments that just have those black keys between C and D, and they tuned it well enough that it could sound close enough to a C sharp as well as close enough to a D flat that your ear would accept it either way. So that's was sort of a new invention in Bach's day, the idea that you could make a keyboard instrument and tune it so that that same black key would sound like both D flat and C sharp, close enough that you could write a song that used them both and play them on the same instrument. So Bach decided to write a whole series of preludes and fugues in every key just to sort of prove that it could be done. So it was, but all this stuff came about from starting with just those 7 pitches, A through G, and then deciding, you know what, I like the sound of that Aeolian, I like the sound of Dorian, but I want to get that Dorian sound starting on A so I can add an F sharp, or I want that Aeolian sound starting on D so I can add a B flat. And then other things, like if you go back to that actual piece, you'll notice at the end of the piece, that's not actually the entire end of the piece that goes on, but this is just the excerpt that I was working on. It has in it not only the F sharp, but a G sharp. Why? Well, because I will come to this in a second, just joining the streaming. Yes, I am here at the school. We have Wi-Fi now. We still don't have the full internet thing going. I still can't access my Regis email. There's some other stuff that I can't do yet, but we're, having some amount of return to normalcy now. It's been crazy. But yeah, this idea that whatever your final is, that we like this note a half step below that final. In fact, we like it so much that a Renaissance person wouldn't have bothered to write it in. They would just write the G and expect, again, the performer to just raise it themselves. Sometimes they would just write the accidental in above the note, this idea of calling it a G sharp and putting it in here. That's a relatively modern thing. I don't know, 1500s or so. But before that, you just wrote the G, or you wrote the G and just wrote in a little symbol up here to remind people, oh, you probably want to sing that a little higher, so you get this leading tone effect. That leading tone is really powerful. That's really where the major scale that's why the major scale won. One of the reasons why it's such a powerful scale now is if you take those same 7 notes that we've been dealing with, but start on C, you end up with that half step there at the end. People love that half step. They love ending a piece with that half step there. So they would be like, oh, well, I totally need to have a G sharp here so I can have a half step there. And they would do that with Dorian also. So when we go back to, well, that was Dorian, right? Because with the F sharp, that was Dorian. Now, if I take this scale and try to put a C sharp in there, now you have this weird gap between the B flat and the C sharp. So that scale is called the harmonic minor. It's got some nice harmonic qualities, but it's awkward melodically. So if we take this B flat and put it back to B, or like we had here with the F sharp, this scale is called the melodic minor. And if I take this back down to F, that is the harmonic minor. So all of these scales, I'm not going to say modern inventions, but they didn't come about as someone saying, hey, let's make a scale. It was more, hey, we've got 7 notes, let's make melodies out of them, and then we're going to add some F sharps when we need them, we're going to add some G sharps when we need them, and we're going to add some B flats when we need them, and we're going to add some C sharps when we need them. And then the idea that, hey, what if we took all those notes and laid them in a row? Maybe we could give it a name. Yeah, that's a thing, but it's not the thing. It's not really what music is about, laying those notes in a row. It's about knowing that those are the notes available, and then you make these modifications to fit the situation. So that's sort of the Renaissance spin on these modes. And yeah, there's a name for them. If you start on C, Ionian mode instead of major scale would have been the name. Starting on E, we call that the Phrygian mode. Starting on F, we call it the Lydian mode. G, I already said, was Mixolydian, Aeolian. Now this guy, Locrian, I don't know the proper Greek pronunciation of the letter O, so I don't know. We usually say Locrian though, in America anyhow. That one was sort of like it exists on paper, but it's not like people wrote a lot of music in that mode. But now, when we talk about a jazz setting, now these modes take on a new meaning because they become sets of notes you can improvise on that fit a particular chord. So if I take that D Dorian, that Dorian scale, just all the notes starting on D, all the official 7 notes, all the white keys, and I just improvise, or to take a more famous improvisation, something like that. That's Miles Davis's improvisation on So What, which is one of the famous modal jazz pieces. And it's just improvising using the notes of that scale while the other harmonic instruments, so he's playing that on trumpet, while other people are kind of playing a D minor-ish chord behind him. So jazz musicians use these modes as ways of organizing improvisation ideas. I'm going to take those same notes and then I'm going to improvise on them. And we might do the same thing the Renaissance people did. Just because I'm officially using Dorian doesn't mean I'm not going to occasionally throw in some C sharps just so I get that leading tone, or occasionally throw in some B flats because I want the sound of Aeolian a little bit in that spot, even though officially I'm supposed to be using Dorian here. But this idea that Dorian scale fits the sound of a D minor chord. In particular, we really do like that B natural, because if we're playing a D minor chord, we really like the sound of that B melodically. So at some point I'm going to drop my computer doing this, but I haven't yet, right? Right, so that B is like a... I don't really know if you can see what I'm doing or if you're getting seasick from this, but whatever. That's like a really cool note, but sometimes it's a cool note too. Just like with Greensleeves, they're both cool, but the B, if I'm going to play a chord down here and a jazz version of that chord, we're going to add all these color notes to it. That B natural is the sound I use a lot more than... That like creates some extra dissonance. And then I might resolve it by going to the B natural. So we think of that B flat as a way of creating dissonance a lot in the jazz world, that making it sound more Aeolian and less Dorian. So anyhow, these are these modes, these scales that exist, and they existed to compose music with in the Renaissance. In jazz, we use these same scales, and then we do use Locrian actually quite a lot, because Locrian ends up being a pretty good choice when you have, and Locrian was the guy starting on B. And one of the reasons this is not used much as a scale is it doesn't have a perfect fifth. It has this interval, it's got a perfect fourth, and then it's got this diminished fifth interval. So it's harder to write melodies that sounded good to Renaissance ears. But if your chord is this, a half diminished chord, oh, I should use the middle pedal. No, it's not a real middle pedal. This is one of those soft pedals masquerading as a middle pedal. Now, we don't normally just sit around and improvise on half diminished chords a lot, but it's part of a chord progression in the key of A minor. Then going to E7, and then A minor. And then I'm going to use that F sharp because we like Dorian so much. So in the course of improvising on that little chord progression, 2-5-1 in the key of A minor, if you're keeping score, I used Locrian over that B half diminished, and then over the E7 I kind of used that harmonic minor-ish. I didn't really do much, but when I got to the A, I used Dorian because I like Dorian so much. This idea that we change scales with every chord, it's not the only way we organize our improvisations by any means. Just knowing what key you're in and fiddling with the notes as you need to fit the key, totally a thing. But ever since like the late 40s, early 50s, it's really been a thing also to learn this whole technique of learning all these different scales. So certainly these 7 modes that you get starting on C, starting Ionian, Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixolydian, Aeolian, Locrian, those 7 modes. But also I mentioned that melodic minor was the other arrangement. Melodic minor is what I got when I did this. This arrangement here. This is the other arrangement of 7 pitches. This one, so the first arrangement we had, Colleen, hey, hi. Yeah, I'm glad you find this interesting. I find it interesting too. I'm just spilling out lots of stuff because it's interesting to me. But this arrangement here, actually when I start on C, it's a little easier to see. I'll start where it is and just label the half steps and whole steps. So H, that one's a whole step, and then and then there's a half step after the B. I'm using Alt-right, by the way, to move to the next pitch. And then a whole step. I'm missing a lot, though. And then a whole step. And then there's a half step. And then there's a whole step. And then there's a whole step. And these are really, they're talking about, right, it's a whole step from the A to the B, a half step from the B to the C, right? So really I should select all these things and move them all to the right, which I can do here in the inspector, move them all to the right. There we go. So now they're kind of showing up between the notes. So it's a little clearer that the whole step is not, A is not a whole step, B is not a whole step, but the space between A and B is a whole step. There we go. And well, so when I did that, so this is still moved just one space over, but now that the notes are further apart, that's not enough. But I'm just going to insert some more measures until it looks good to me. There we go. So this arrangement here, basically, and if I kept going from here, I'm doing some cut and paste here. And then this. Oh, hey, Siri.
Sorry, I couldn't.
I didn't say anything. Siri thought I was talking to her. That's curious. I don't know what I just did there because I got distracted by Siri, but Control T. Okay, so the half steps are 2 whole steps apart or 3 whole steps apart. That, and no matter where we start here, if we start on A, that's the case. We start on C, that's the case. It's just a question of where in that pattern we start, because really a scale is a circle. Yeah, it goes up and up octaves, so maybe it's a spiral. But at some level, it's whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half, whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half, whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. It's just a question of where you start in that pattern. The melodic minor scale, the one that I got when I raised that to an F sharp and this to a G sharp, what that changes is, well, it changes that to a whole step, this stays a whole step, and this guy becomes a half step. I said, and then I do the same thing here. So now that's a whole step, and that's a half step. So the melodic minor scale, the one that I got when I added both the F sharp and the G sharp, it's got 4 whole steps between the half steps, and then only 1 between. So that's a different arrangement. It's not just starting that same pattern, because that other pattern had 2 whole steps and 3 whole steps. If you think about it, those are the black keys on the piano, right? Groups of 2, groups of 3. That's really what we're talking about. Is that's why it's a whole step, because there's room for a black key between them, if you want to think of it that way. So all those modes were just different rearrangements of those same 7 pitches that had 2 whole steps and 3 whole steps. Melodic minor is an arrangement that's got 4 whole steps and 1 whole step between our half steps. And this also, we can get different scales if we start here. So here is called melodic minor. If we start here, this scale has its own name. It goes under several different names, but the diminished whole tone scale, the superlocrian scale, the altered scale, this scale here, sometimes called Lydian augmented, this one here, Lydian dominant. This guy here doesn't really get a super common name. Some people just call it the 5th mode. I've heard a couple different names there, but there's none that are super, super common. This guy here is kind of like Locrian, but Locrian starts off with a half step. This guy starts off with a whole step. That's the only difference. So it's sometimes called Locrian sharp 2, because it's like Locrian, but the second note is raised. Instead of starting with a half step, it's starting with a whole step. And this guy starting with G sharp is kind of like the Phrygian scale, but it's got a raised 6th. So it's sometimes called Phrygian raised 6th or Phrygian sharp 6. So anyhow, those sets of scales, those 7 modes that we get by taking A through G and starting in different places, but also the 7 scales we get if we take melodic minor and start in the 7 places, that's 14 scales. Toss in a few others like the whole tone scale, it's all whole steps. Or Yeah, you can make a lot of music just with those scales. But I will say the one other one that's really kind of interesting is one that we might get if we still start off minor like this, but maybe decide to put in both an F and an F sharp, or both a G and a G sharp, or for that matter, both a C and a C sharp. So they're more like adding extra notes to these scales. Um, there's all these different scales. Oh, one other scale in jazz that we use a lot. It's called the diminished scale, or in classical theory, sometimes it's called the octatonic scale because it's got 8 notes. So do some of these other scales I just mentioned. But it's whole step, half step, whole step, half step, whole step, half step, whole step, half step, alternating whole steps and half steps. And it outlines a diminished chord. And so depending on whether you start with a whole step or a half step, you get different ways of using that. As a jazz musician, you live and breathe a lot of this theory if you're going to be dealing with a lot of modern, like, last 50 to 60 years music, because a lot of the chord progressions were written such to give you opportunities to improvise using these scales. Much older music, music of the 40s or 30s or whatever, and plenty of current music also, doesn't require you. Like, no, you don't have to know about the Lydian augmented scale to play anything written in the 1940s. But I guarantee there's a lot of stuff written in the 1960s that you can't play successfully without knowing this scale, because it's got chords in it that require you to play chords that have both an F sharp and a G sharp, but C as the root. And then you kind of need to know this scale. So a lot of what jazz musicians do is just learn all these scales, and not just that scale starting on C, but that same Lydian augmented scale starting on D, or starting on C flat, C sharp, starting everywhere. It's an unbelievable number of scales to learn to do this successfully, so much so that people sort of think, oh, well, you can never do that. And yet you can. If you work at it. It's like, if someone told you and you didn't already speak, you could have a vocabulary of like 20,000 words, and you'd know how to spell them all and conjugate all the verbs and speak in real time like this. Like I said, speak in real time. I didn't say spoke. I speak. You speak, but he speaks, right? I don't have to think about that. This just comes out. I got a million of them. I mean, literally, right? I mean, okay, I don't have a million. I got 20,000 of them. That's probably my vocabulary, I think. Some number of thousands of words. I just know. I don't have to think about them. I just know them. So I guarantee I can play 72 scales, right? If I can play 20,000 words, I can play 72 scales, or however many there are. 12 scales, 12 roots times 7 scales is 84 scales from each mode. So then 168, sorry, doing my math right. Wow. I know 168 scales, and then the diminished scales, a couple hundred scales, whatever. I know 20,000 words, but I can play 200 scales for you. And it's not that much more amazing, really. The only thing amazing is that, well, we didn't grow up with this. I had to learn it kind of as an adult. Anyhow, that's a whole bunch of stuff about scales and modes, and it all kind of came about from just dealing with these original 7 notes and really thinking about Dorian and Aeolian and how much people liked them both and wanted them to sound more like each other, to be able to get Dorian but have Aeolian but have little hints of Dorianness, or have Dorian but have hints of Aeolianness, and then have that leading tone also. And so this Renaissance history behind these scales is where they came from. But the modern applications to them is now knowing, well, we can create an Aeolian scale anywhere, not just on A, but we can make an E-flat Aeolian scale if we want, and use that as a basis for creating music and so forth, improvising especially. You can compose using these modes also, and people do, but it's jazz musicians that really tend to live and breathe this stuff, and of course we do more improvising than composing usually. So, that's some background about modes and scales, again, because of Dorian with the hurricane. So was it last week? No, last week I broadcast from here. 2 weeks ago, I broadcast from my parents' home in Florida, which, was in the path of the hurricane. At one point, that hurricane was making a beeline for my parents' house, I have to say. It was like Jupiter is North Palm Beach, but they're living in Jupiter now. But anyhow, that's where the hurricane was heading at one point, between North Palm and Jupiter. And then, of course, it started veering and doing other things. So Florida kind of got off the hook, more or less. I mean, yeah, they're getting heavy storms and all, but everyone's fine. And hopefully the storm continues to do fine as far as the United States goes. But let's keep the Bahamas in our thoughts here, because they got to have some serious cleanup to do from Dorian. So anyhow, that's the more serious note. Next week, I do intend to talk more about MuseScore 3, talk about these funny new palettes. I mean, they're not that different, but they're going to have some interesting new capabilities and things for customization. And as always, I take suggestions for topics that you want to hear about, and just keep doing this every week. Meanwhile, I again want to just let you know, like last week, I was the back to school thing, and I was talking about these handouts I'm putting together. I now have I don't know, about 7 of these things so far, and I'm slowly making more of them to basically, it's going to be a theory mini textbook that's all based on just MuseScore files, and then combine that with some video lectures, and that's going to be my online course, and I hope to have that open for business pretty soon, and I'll be talking about that. All right, I feel another sneeze coming on. I think I'm just going to actually sign off now, since there don't seem to be any other questions at the moment. Hope, again, this was interesting and maybe even slightly useful, even though I was scattered and fast talking about it all. But I will catch up with everyone next week. All right, see ya. Bye.